David Robinson, the father of Daniel Cornelius Robinson, who went missing on June the 23rd of 2021. Daniel graduated from the College of Charleston, South Carolina. He came out to Phoenix, Arizona, where he landed his job with Matrix New World as a field geologist. So he really enjoyed being here in Arizona because he get to span his horizons. He's a special child. When my son was born, he was missing his right hand. The way he grew up, his mentality, he taught himself how to play the trumpet. Some people thought that was impossible. He did the French horn, he even though he did a little bit of the trombone. He played a little bit of football, doing sports like that, basketball. Everything he tried to accomplish, he did that.
He was used to people saying, why were you born like that? And he'll just say, that's the way God made me. That's what makes him so special. He would not let anyone tell him what he couldn't do with his prosthesis. He wore it until high school. When he got to college, he says, I'm done with it. This is me. I love me. And whoever doesn't like what they see, oh well. And he just loved his friends. But he really wasn't dating. He said, there's nobody like my mom. I was like, okay. What compelled Daniel to become a geologist is climate change, and he wanted to make a difference. In Arizona, they have to drill for water sources because it's so dry and, hot out there. He tests the soil to see if the water would be drinkable, if it have parasites. And he'd been working in remote deserts. And sometimes I was wondering if he didn't go to Arizona, would he be missing?
My name is Ken Elliott. I'm a pump technician for Weber Water Resources. On the morning of June 23rd, we arrived at the job site at 9:30, and I walked over to Daniel's Jeep to introduce myself. We spoke about a few technical aspects of the job and where we were at on the development phase of this well. It was raining fairly hard at that point. I had asked him whether or not we wanted to just hang tight and let this storm cell pass overhead before we started so we wouldn't get all of our paperwork wet. This is where things started to become odd. When I looked up, Daniel was staring off into the desert. He had a very, very distant look in his eyes. That's when he got in his Jeep and left. Must have been around 2:30. The principal of the firm called me. They had not heard from Daniel yet. I hopped in my work truck. The only tracks were Daniel's because the storms had washed all the dirt roads clear. When I got to that intersection, my heart sank because Daniel's tracks didn't make a left and head east towards home. They made a right-hand turn and headed west out in the desert. And I thought, he's so far out in front of me. He could be anywhere.
My sister Davisha gives me a call, like, hey, Daniel's missing. One of his friends from work came over to my apartment and let me know that they couldn't find him. Daniel's never been the person to give up or to quit anything or to just walk away. So for him to go to work for a few hours and then just leave out of nowhere, didn't say anything to anybody, the red flags were going up for sure.
I'm freaking out. Well, that's why I'm gonna call his phone. I called it, he didn't answer. Called it again, he didn't answer. And the next time I left a message to Dane, this is Mom, you know how I am. I'm worried now. I'm worried about you. I need you to pick up this phone. He didn't pick up the phone. I text him. I have the text. I say, hey son, where are you? You need to answer your phone.
I remember exactly what I was doing on June the 23rd, 2021. I'm retired military. I was sitting on my back porch in Columbia, South Carolina. When I received that phone call from his sister telling me that it was well over 6 hours that he was missing from that job, that was problematic for me because I know Daniel, he would not go that long without saying anything to his siblings or his mother or myself. He'll let us know something. We called Dane's phone, his ring, and finally go to the voicemail. until I guess it finally died, and it goes straight to the voicemail. We didn't hear from him that whole entire day. That's when I knew something was wrong, and I decided to report him missing. I called the Buckeye Police Department. I talked to Officer Cruz. One of the biggest things that I was really happy about is that he decided to take a drive down this road called Sun Valley Parkway. He told me he was out there to look and see if maybe he's stranded on the side of the road somewhere. Of course, they told me quickly they didn't find my son. You know, you find out your child is missing. Of course, I'm not going to sleep. On June 24th, I grabbed everything that I can, threw it in my vehicle, and started heading out west to Arizona. Guessing over 20-some hours. It was the hardest drive. It seemed like I couldn't get here fast enough. One thing I learned out of the military is never leave a fallen comrade behind. One of the first things I did when I decided to hit that road to head to Arizona to find my son was to make my son a mission. Of course, your child is missing. It can put you in an emotional state. In the military, we learn how to put those emotions at bay. He is my mission. The first thing I did is went up to the Buckeye Police Department, got more information about where he was last seen. I found out it was in the desert itself.
I'm Nicole Griggin. I'm a reporter with ABC 15 here in Phoenix. I don't think people realize that here in Arizona, we're actually one of the top 5 states for missing persons. There's just so much desert that getting lost or being stranded in the desert, you're out there on your own. So it doesn't take long for dehydration to set in, your skin burning. The elements out there are really severe and unsurvivable, really.
The desert environment in the summer is very, very harsh. It can get up to 110, 115 degrees. So you clearly have to be prepared, food, water, plenty of provisions. And the wildlife that you need to watch out for are rattlesnakes. They're territorial, they have dens. When they come out, they're cold-blooded, so they'll typically be coiled up on a rock or somewhere in the sun to warm up. And they blend in with their native surroundings. You may not even see one until you're almost on top of it.
You're not up against just the heat, the sun, the elements, but people do go out to the deserts to recreate, shoot off guns. We're talking rifles, assault rifles. There's the risk of cartels, drugs crossing, people smuggling people across the border.
I know the desert is just a place where bad things happen. I mean, I have watched many shows, of course, to know that, you know, that's not like a hangout area. So I was worried that maybe he ran into foul play.
On June 25th, Daniel had been missing for 2 days at this point. Buckeye police did their first aerial search by helicopter looking for him. They searched this area all around his work site, and they weren't able to find any trace of him. So Buckeye police were putting up flyers in the desert and at the local airport in case people passing through may have seen him get on a plane.
When someone is missing, it's very crucial to search immediately. You shouldn't have to wait. That make it slimmer. Statistic-wise, less likely you'll recover that person.
If someone does die out in the desert, bodies can decompose out there and be left to bones and fragments pretty quickly. Here in Maricopa County, the ME's office has pages of unidentified people that were in the desert, and they're still left unidentified for years.
With my time in Afghanistan, dealing with desert, I just knew my son was in trouble. If he's out there riding around in that heat out there in that desert, that's very dangerous. I wonder if he had water and things like that. So those kind of things went across my mind. The first thing I went to do is get out there to that well site. That was the last spot that my son was supposed to have been seen at. But Buckeye Police Department told me not to go into the desert, so I would take my binoculars close to the area where the well site would be at. My heart was racing, of course, and I tried to imagine myself as being my son, where he was staring off to. And I just need to understand what he was feeling, what he was thinking at the moment.
So while my father was there in Arizona, my other sister in California and the sister in Arizona, we were on social media trying to figure out what's been happening before Daniel went missing. He deleted all of his images off of Instagram, so I'm thinking, does it mean anything? And it's just, at least for me, it was very upsetting that the police department, no one took it seriously enough to say, something's not right, he is missing. We know it may look like he just walked away, but something's not right with this.
A day or so prior to him going missing, Daniel called me and he left me a voicemail. And that's the last message that I have for Daniel.
If you're free, you could call me back if you want, but in other words, I just want to let you know regardless, I love you. And yeah, we can talk later. All right, bye.
I didn't think about it at the time, but I didn't like what I heard. I didn't like him saying, well, Mama, no matter what, I love you. I heard it in his voice. His voice didn't sound right. And I beat myself up about why didn't I answer that phone that night.
When I first heard that Daniel was missing, I was at work and I got a call from one of our mutual friends, a kid that had also graduated with us from college. I think it was only a day or so after Daniel was reported missing. It was just really weird to hear because I had just seen him a couple days ago. I had visited Daniel on Thursday, June 17th. That weekend when I was with him, everything seemed pretty normal as far as I was concerned. Daniel was kind of showing me around Phoenix. I had never really explored the city before, so he took me to a few of his favorite places. I hadn't seen him in at least a year. I remember he was super excited to be able to hang out together. I met Daniel in one of our geology classes together. We quickly became friends because we were both guys that like to goof around. Daniel was a very friendly, social guy, and the last time that I saw Daniel, he did mention to me that he had met this girl. He didn't go too into detail with anything about it, but I was excited for him because I had never known him to have a girlfriend or anything super serious going on.
He worked a second job where he met this young lady, and I think at that moment just was infatuated, on first sight and wanted to get to know her a little better, so they exchanged numbers at some point. They was texting back and forth for a little bit. I'll say just a few weeks. They did go on one date together, nothing very serious.
When he told me he was going out on a date with her, I was so happy for him because I knew it was just a while since he been out on a date. So he was quite excited. And I think it was just a love at first sight with him in the beginning with her. But I told him, you gotta remember, a woman likes to be pursued just for a little bit. Then if the feelings are not mutual, then it's time to back away from her.
So early on in the investigation, there was this woman who Daniel was seeing that Buckeye police were told to look into and see if she has any idea on where he might be. Police eventually track her down, and she says that she doesn't know where he is, that she hasn't seen him. But this woman does end up sharing with Buckeye police her last text exchanges with Daniel. What exactly does it mean that you'll never see me again? It kind of raised some concerns on what was his mental state at the time when he went missing.
Prior to him going missing, Daniel, he would say stuff like, you have to watch out for your self-being. Sometimes you have to be able to cut people off if they're hurting your feelings. And don't talk to them for a while, because you have to protect your mental being instead of having somebody always hurting your feelings.
Within the last month or so prior to him going missing, there's a big shift in his personality just because he's been so shut off and reserved. I didn't want to press him too hard to have him freeze up or to, shut away from answering anything. But we tried to gauge and see where he was mentally, like if he's doing okay.
I know my child was lonely. I know he wanted friends to talk to on a regular. He had no female companionship. All he had was his sister. And that's mainly was me and Daniel conversations prior to him leaving. It's just, The frustration of life and COVID. You've been in the house for a whole year. And you know, all his friends are in Charleston and Colorado. He didn't have any friends there, and he wanted friends so bad, just people to hang out with, talk to.
It's been over a week. No signs of Daniel. Unfortunately, his family didn't have a key to get inside his apartment. Police weren't able to get a warrant because they needed a proof of crime. So they actually went to the landlord to get inside to do a wellness check at this time. His apartment was an indication of where his mind may have been at the time.
When I entered his apartment, I seen my son pain. I seen the stress. I seen the pain. I felt the sadness. I mean, dishes in the sink, dishes on the floor, clothes on the floor, disheveled bathroom, hairs on the floor, just chaos and misery.
I lived with him since he was born. Daniel's never been like an organized person, but this was beyond even him. Like, it was dirty. It was bad. Daniel's never been the kind of person to live like that. You can just see that he was clearly going through something, and he stopped caring about his living space.
I think Daniel just snapped. He said, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm trying to be productive at my job and my life, and every time I take 2 steps forward, I get pulled 5 steps back. I get off work and I work another job. Is it supposed to be this way? Is this how life's supposed to be for me? He said, I'm tired for a moment. I need to breathe. I don't need to worry about this right now. But there's nothing in this world will make him ever dream of taking his life. I mean, Daniel never really bit his tongue on telling me anything. If he was feeling crazy or ooky about himself, I think he'll come to me and say, listen, Mom, I'm having some serious issues right now. I really need your help. I really do believe that he would tell me he's having some real serious issues.
I guess as his older sibling, I've always worried about my siblings, but I don't think he would have harmed himself. He was forward-thinking. The days before he went missing, he was suggesting that he was going to find another job at some point, or he's going to move. He had plans to do something else, so I don't think he would have harmed himself.
I last spoke to my son 2 days prior to him going missing. Him and his sister had plans to go hiking that weekend. We talked about my plans to come up there in July to visit him.
Knowing Daniel, I don't think he's the type of person that would want to run away from anything. He had a lot of good friends and a good family, so I think that he had a pretty good life.
I was in so much pain, and I didn't know how much more I can take without knowing where my son is. The pain and the stress of seeing Daniel in my dreams calling my name. I said, God, you gotta give me something. Then we received a tip, and I was excited. I'm going to find my son.
Around that time on July 7th, I did get information from the Buckeye Police Department telling me there was a report of somebody calling in and saying they saw someone that fit the description of my son Daniel, but somebody who was also missing a limb.
A woman, I believe, from Phoenix, Arizona, spotted someone who appeared to be my brother at a grocery store. Just something about him drew her to him. She went over to speak to the kid. He doesn't look like he's homeless. And she said that the kid said, oh, I'm just on a journey right now, something I have to do. And she offered him granola bar, some water, told him to be safe. She wanted to take a picture, like if someone was looking for him, but then the person declined, no pictures of me, please.
It was the detectives from Buckeye Police Department who was able to go there and check that out. But according to them, that wasn't Daniel.
So it disappointed me tremendously. I just want my son back.
At this point, it's 2 weeks in, no signs of Daniel. Buckeye Police reached out to the Civil Air Patrol. It's a nonprofit with the U.S. Air Force to assist and do another aerial search for him.
They showed up around 8 o'clock that morning. There's gonna be a few flyovers over there where my son was last seen. I was present. They just kind of zigzag until they made their way up north. Did a search for, I say roughly, they got finished roughly around 11 o'clock that morning. The next day gave me a map of the area that they searched. They didn't come up with anything, they came up empty.
Daniel's father, David, at this point, he had nothing to go on. So David created his own website, pleasehelpfinddanielrobinson.com, hoping he would start to get information on what happened to his son.
This is David Robinson. I'm the father of geologist Daniel Robinson, who went missing in the desert of Buckeye, Arizona. Coming out for this live to tell you all I have a tip line that I'm paying for. So please, I'm really desperate here trying to find my son. I'm really depending on you all to help.
It was really his effort on social media, pushing the public to send any information that was helping tips come in on who may have seen Daniel.
Anytime somebody have leads, I follow a lot of leads. I've been to Sedona, to Flagstaff, and a couple other places, but I came back with a negative result. It wasn't Daniel.
Buckeye Police is a smaller police department in comparison to the surrounding cities, and they have a lot of land to cover. So David posted on the website, he asked the community for help. He started to put together these community searches out in the desert.
I just wanted to come out live to tell you all that I am having a search tomorrow. You guys, if you can, please come along. All the information that you need will be on pleasehelpfinddaniel.com. I was able to start my own searches that way. We put out the information about the search to the public, and people showed up. I'm really grateful you coming out here from the bottom of my heart to search for my son, Daniel. The terrain is really huge and large, and I can't do it by myself, so I'm really grateful for you all coming out. We have a mapping system. We have those maps broken down to grids. Say, hey, today we're searching this grid.
I just couldn't imagine being in David's shoes, not knowing where Daniel's at. I can't imagine not having answers.
Keep on looking for Daniel because my heart tells me to, and for the family.
I always say that if I or any one of my family or loved ones ever went missing, I would want someone to do the same thing for me. I feel his pain, and I feel like I know Daniel through him.
I thank everybody for searching for Daniel. I really, really, really appreciate it that they took the time out of their busy schedules to help find my son.
Oh! They've got a bone there.
Couldn't move, I was really stunned. It was scary because then I realized my son went missing in an area where things was happening, obviously. So it makes it really bad for me and make it tough.
What we're looking at is top of the skull right here, and then a piece of vertebrae. Trying to identify to see what this is compared to the human anatomy, is an app that I've got that we can quickly identify to see if it matches anything. I'm going to go ahead and upload this. I'm going to shoot a message over to the medical examiner, and we'll have them evaluate it. But I'm pretty sure this is a small animal, probably a coyote.
I was relieved. It was animal remains, but it's a roller coaster. When I go out to the desert search, for instance, every day is like day one. You go out there in hopes to find my son alive, out there and rescue him. Then it gets grimmer and grimmer as the months have been passing by.
David and these volunteers were out there first thing in the morning before the heat. And sadly, all these efforts, they still weren't finding any trace of Daniel. On July 19th, nearly a month since Daniel went missing, finally Buckeye Police have a break in the case.
The Buckeye Police Department called me and told me, hey, look, Mr. Robinson, we found Daniel's vehicle in a 20-foot ravine in a remote area of the desert. You know, the first thing I'm thinking, the next sentence will be that they found my son.
Daniel Robinson was last seen June 23rd, 2021. If you have any information, please contact the Buckeye Police tip line at 623-349-6411.
The Buckeye Police Department called and told me, hey, look, we didn't find Daniel, we just have his vehicle. A rancher checking for his cattle out in a remote area of the desert ran into Daniel's Jeep Renegade in a 20-foot ravine.
The car been wrecked. In my mind, I'm thinking, what if he's hurt? I was at a total stage of panic, scared beyond anything I ever felt in my life.
The airbags were deployed. The sunroof was kicked out, but still no sign of Daniel here.
When he wasn't in the car, it's like a moment of relief, hope, and then dread at the same time. You could be taken out quickly in the desert.
I remember seeing this vehicle for the first time the way it was, and it was very devastating. The detective asked me, he said, Mr. Robinson, it was because we standing at a distance, he said, you go over there and you can look inside the vehicle. I just couldn't move, I was really stunned.
Inside the car, all of Daniel's personal items, his backpack, his cell phone, his keys. And then on the outside of the car, his clothes were scattered all around like he threw them off. And then his wallet was found inside his jeans with all of his credit cards. Is he naked in the middle of the desert in this heat? And then we learned that in the trunk there were 2 cases of water.
You know, with his degree, he knows and understands, you know, the desert terrain a lot. You can only survive out there with extreme dry heat for very long without water. He wouldn't have left all the water, or at least if he got into the wreck, my thought is he would probably stay in the car where it's shaded and he has the water and it's more safe and contained.
Daniel's car was found 3 miles from the well site where he was last seen.
Assuming that Daniel crashed his Jeep so close to the job site, he could have very easily walked back to the job site in less than an hour.
And it just makes you wonder, wouldn't you have seen it if you were doing these ground searches, if you were doing these aerial searches? And all of a sudden, here it is in this ravine 3 miles away. I think there were a lot of concerns that how did this car get here? It had to have been placed here by someone. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere when we've been searching this area for so long.
It wasn't covered. There was, you know, there were no rocks on it. There were no debris on the car. You know, bluish Jeep out in the middle of a brownish red desert. Even with it being in a ravine, I just don't believe that they would have possibly have missed that from the air. So I think the car showed back up after the searches.
I had a theory that was given to me by someone at the Buckeye Police Department what they think happened to my son. They felt like, you know, he escaped that rollover without injury because they didn't see any blood in the vehicle. He kicked the glass out of the sunroof and got out. But they also believe that he had a severe head injury. And once he got out of the vehicle, he shredded his clothes because the brain injury make you feel hot. And you feel hot and you shred your clothes. And he may have walked off, succumbed to his injuries.
If he was in this accident, he was likely really hurt. And he was out of his mind, so to speak. And that's kind of the only explanation that we saw, that Daniel maybe didn't have any idea what had happened to him. Maybe that's why he left his keys. Maybe that's why he left the water. Maybe that's why he just started walking in the middle of the desert, but we don't know.
Like, maybe if you did get hot, you take your shirt off at least, but I don't think my brother would strip down naked and leave all of his clothes there. It was very upsetting because any person, whether mentally sound or not, can't walk through that for very long and get very far that you couldn't see them. There's no way my brother would have gotten within 3 miles of the site and maybe not find any inkling that he was there. This doesn't add up.
One thing that bothered me the most, I had severe head injury from IED blast. That's the reason why I'm retired from the military, and I never shredded my clothes off. So when they told me that, I couldn't understand the science behind that. So that made me want to get my own investigator, get a second opinion.
My name is Jeff McGrath. I am a criminal private investigator. I specialize in accident reconstruction. David Robinson reached out to me a couple of days after they found the vehicle. He felt there was something that wasn't right with the vehicle and with the investigation. The vehicle itself, as I started working my way around it, we noticed there was damage significantly to the right front side of the vehicle. That's probably what blew the airbags in the vehicle. It had to have struck something fairly large, and it had to be pretty solid to cause the damage I saw. Where the vehicle was laid, there was nothing around it that immediately that I could see that would have caused all the damage I was seeing on the vehicle. It didn't make sense, so it needed some further investigation. The police department had turned over the report of the airbag control module, as some people call it the black box of the vehicle. When I started to analyze the crash data report, the vehicle was doing anywhere from 29 to just over 30 miles an hour, consistently all the way through up to airbag deployment. And that again takes me back to the terrain. I took my vehicle out there and I tried the same thing. I couldn't get it above 15 miles an hour. It was absolutely just insane doing it. It was too rough. When you go out there and you stand out there, you can see its ridges and valleys, and it's just not possible. Then I got onto a all-terrain vehicle, and I attempted it with that as well. And that thing, I got up just about 22 miles an hour. To imagine Daniel's vehicle traveling that long at that speed in the area where it was recovered, it doesn't make sense. It's not physically possible. The crash data report also indicated at the time of airbag deployment, the vehicle had then driven another 11 miles. So the 11 miles leads me to believe the vehicle was definitely moved after the initial airbag deployment. And there's no doubt in my mind of that.
Based on the evidence that the private investigator gave us, I just think that maybe Daniel wanted to get away for a moment and then abandoned his car somewhere in the Buckeye area. Someone or some people found his car and just took it. Once the news was released that Daniel's missing, this is his car, they might have dumped the car in attempts to just absolve themselves and not be caught up in an investigation. Because it doesn't make sense that a person could survive a car crash of that nature, rolling down the hill the way it rolled down. There was no forensic evidence of blood, nothing that would suggest that Daniel was in the car at the time of that wreckage. So it looks like it was staged there, like it was placed. Who did it, we don't know.
Remember, I'm on a mission to find out what happened to my son. So I expanded my searches out to cover the area where the vehicle was found.
Daniel's father, David, is determined to find his son. He's been here in Arizona leading search parties every Saturday since his son vanished, and those search parties are making a difference. On July 31st, a shocking discovery by one of his father's search teams, finding a human skull and shoulder. The team immediately alerted the Buckeye police.
I just hit the floor and I just couldn't hold myself together. In my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, a body, my child is gone.
I did receive a call from my dad. They did find the skull out there. And that was a pretty tough time.
We have CC Buckeye Police has taped off the scene, and at this point, medical examiners confirmed it, and we don't know whose it is.
I try to keep as much hope as I can. I try to keep my emotions at bay, so it makes it really bad for me. It's scary.
In my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, a body, my child is gone. I lost it. I lost it. I went into an uncontrollable cry, and it wouldn't stop. It wouldn't stop. I hit the floor. I mean, I woke up in the middle of the night crying and calling Daniel's name. I was calling people that I know from the church to pray with me.
Shortly after discovering this skull, it was determined that it wasn't Daniel. But the medical examiner's office thought they knew who this may have been. You know, it could be closure for another family.
You know, just to find their loved one that way. My heart broke for someone, but at least Daniel helped bring someone home. So that makes me proud.
Thank you guys for your prayers and support. Came negative for anything that's related to my son, so I'm grateful for that. So thank you guys for your help and your love.
I can't imagine how emotional it would be for the family to have to continue to do these searches. wanting to find Daniel. But at the same time, you don't want it to be finding him in the desert, because then you know that you have to lay him to rest.
Trying to get my spirits back up. It's kind of rough today. Like I say, my spirits are down mentally. Very hard today for me. Very depressing, you know. Been a long time searching for my son, but I'm still pushing it. Thank you guys for your support. God bless you. Thank you for everything you do and all your help, so keep it going. The volunteers that's there, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, sisters, uncles, you name it. And you know, I say one thing about them, they're passionate. I mean, it's hot out there. They're really looking. That's the reason why we find human remains. They're really passionately looking. They really care. They show empathy and things like that, and they stick out there with me.
Mr. Robinson is so dependent on volunteers, and if I imagine it, that his son was like someone in my family, that's what got me coming out. I want to help and bring closure to him and his family.
I'm here for the long haul. There's about a handful of us that come here every Saturday, so I'm not gonna give up. As long as I'm here, you know.
I wanted to get involved any way that I could and join them for one of the searches. The search was pretty scary, just the thought of potentially finding my friend out there in the desert, but it was definitely warmed my heart to see how many people had shown up, these random strangers that had all gathered together for this kid that they had never even met.
You know, no matter what's going on in our lives, this is important. We've dedicated ourselves to this, and he needs the help. So we're there for him as long as it takes.
I had an auntie, and she said, David, when will there be a time to come in your head to say enough is enough? I did all I can and just move on. That was hard for me. That is still hard for me. I can't even get that in my brain. You know, it's not a time where I can actually say that to myself. I can't even envision a date when I would say, yeah, I think I did enough, and enough is enough, and it's time for me to stop now.
In September, Daniel had been missing for 3 months now. At this time, Gabby Petito goes missing. And you start seeing these headlines on national outlets just asking for help and finding her. And you see Gabby Petito's face everywhere.
Missing for weeks. Now the family of the Northport woman who was last heard from in August while on a cross-country drive with a boyfriend wants answers.
You see the coverage of Gabby Petito, and then you had on social media people raising the concern that there are people of color missing across the country who aren't getting the same type of coverage. And I think that's what really brought to light Daniel's case. And Daniel's family was starting to get this national coverage that they had been seeking.
Right now, about 600,000 missing persons are in the U.S. Many of them are people of color whose cases have not gotten the same attention as those of young white women like Gabby Petito.
At that moment, I was so excited. I'm like, oh my gosh, like someone's actually, heard our stories. All of our hard work is finally getting out there that, he's missing. Like maybe this can really help us get this going.
The attention paid to the Gabby Petito mystery is raising questions about others who disappear with little, if any, coverage. For instance, 24-year-old geologist Daniel Robinson vanished after work one day in Buckeye, Arizona. His father believes people of color who go missing are generally disregarded.
Every situation should be handled the same way. I think first 24, 48 hours is crucial to finding someone.
We shouldn't have to depend on other stories or other cases to push our own story. And we just want answers just like anyone else. I think, my brother or everyone else's brother or father, siblings, whoever they may be, they deserve the same attention.
Look, and Daniel is a very special person. We hope that some more eyeballs on this case might get some more answers for you as you continue your search for him.
It was kind of that really sad feeling knowing that everyone is seeing this and there's still no indication on what happened to him.
What I would say for the people at home, to keep sending your prayers and your thoughts to our family. This kind of thing is very difficult, very hard to go through. This is something that you'll see on TV and you think, oh my gosh, this would never happen to my family. We're different.
It always begins with a scream no one hears. A sliding glass door shattering in the dark. A shadow moving through a suburban hallway. The soft click of a handgun being cocked beside a sleeping couple who will never feel safe again. California, mid-1970s. Quiet neighborhoods. Freshly cut lawns. Porch lights glowing like promises. The American dream stretched across miles of cul-de-sacs and citrus groves. And somewhere in that darkness, a man was watching. They would call him many names. The East Area Rapist. The original Night Stalker. A phantom. A rumor whispered at backyard barbecues. But long before the world knew the term Golden State Killer, there was only fear. Raw, electric, contagious fear. It started small. Or at least that's how it seemed. Burglaries in suburban Sacramento. Windows pried open with surgical precision. Jewelry missing. Coins taken from jars. Nothing dramatic. Nothing headline-worthy. Just enough to unsettle a family, to make them double-check their locks at night. Then the phone calls began. Breathing on the other end. Long, silent pauses. A sudden whisper, "I'm going to kill you." Teenage girls reported seeing a man lurking in backyards, staring through bedroom windows. Police chalked it up to a peeping Tom. A prowler. A nuisance. They were wrong. By 1976, the crimes escalated. A masked intruder slipping into homes after midnight. He studied routines. He knew when husbands worked night shifts, when children were away at sleepovers. He would break in quietly, stack dishes on the back of a husband's back, while he lay bound on the bedroom floor, warning him that if he heard the plates rattle, he would kill them both. Control. That was the signature. Absolute control. He tied ligatures with meticulous care. He whispered threats in a trembling, almost frantic voice, as if arguing with himself. He prowled the house for hours, rummaging through drawers, eating food from the refrigerator, making phone calls from the victim's home. He turned suburban sanctuaries into stages for psychological warfare. Headlines screamed, "Night Stalker terrorizes Sacramento." Neighborhood meetings overflowed with frightened residents. Gun sales spiked. Husbands took turns staying awake with baseball bats. Women enrolled in self-defense classes. The police urged calm, but calm had already fled the county. He struck again. And again. Dozens of times. Always at night. Always masked. Always vanishing into the dark. Detectives began to see patterns. Shoe prints. Military-style knots. A knowledge of police response times. He used stolen bicycles to move silently through neighborhoods, abandoning them in canals or fields. He was disciplined. Organized. Patient. And he was evolving. By the late 1970s, the attacks spread beyond Sacramento into Contra Costa County. Jurisdictions clashed. Communication faltered. This was before centralized databases, before digital crime mapping. Each county guarded its own files, its own theories. The killer exploited the gaps. The rapes became more violent. The taunts more brazen. He called previous victims months later, whispering their names, proving he had never truly left. Then, suddenly, silence. For a moment, it seemed as if the nightmare had ended. Patrol cars still cruised, but weeks passed without incident. Some believed he had been arrested for an unrelated crime. Others thought he had died. Moved away. Burned out. They were wrong again. In 1979, hundreds of miles south, a young couple in Goleta was found bludgeoned to death in their bed. No signs of forced entry. The husband bound. The wife assaulted. The brutality was shocking, intimate, personal. Yet there was no suspect. Months later, another couple in Ventura County. Same method. Same bindings. Same cold efficiency. Investigators hesitated to connect the crimes. The earlier attacks had been rapes, not murders. This was something else. A different monster. But the ligatures told a story. The knots were familiar. The staging felt rehearsed. The killer had not disappeared. He had refined his craft. Newspapers coined another name, the original Night Stalker. Panic returned, this time sharper, heavier. These were not survivable assaults. These were executions. Between 1979 and 1986, at least 10 people were murdered across Southern California. Young couples. A fiancé weeks away from marriage. A military man and his wife. A successful professional and the woman who loved him. Bludgeoned in their beds, skulls crushed by a heavy object never conclusively recovered. There were no eyewitnesses who saw his face. Only fragments. A white male. Athletic build. Late 20s to early 30s. Brown hair. A composite sketch that seemed both specific and useless at the same time. The investigation sprawled. Task forces formed, dissolved, reformed. Detectives chased thousands of leads. Suspicious ex-boyfriends. Transient workers. Known burglars. Nothing stuck. And then, as abruptly as he had appeared, the killings stopped. One final murder in Irvine. After that, nothing. No taunting calls. No new victims. Just a trail of broken families and cold case files gathering dust. The decades rolled forward. The world changed. DNA technology emerged, transforming criminal investigations. Old evidence was retested. Biological samples preserved from the 1970s was suddenly capable of speaking. The same genetic profile linked the rapes in Northern California to the murders in the South. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were one and the same. A single predator. Dozens of assaults. At least 13 murders. More than 50 rapes. Over 100 burglaries. One man. Yet his name remained unknown. Retired detectives refused to let it go. They pored over case files in their living rooms. They revisited crime scenes now occupied by new families unaware of the horror that once unfolded in their bedrooms. Survivors, now middle-aged, carried invisible scars. Some slept with lights on. Some moved out of state. Some never spoke publicly again. The case became legend. A cautionary tale whispered in true crime circles. Golden State Killer, a name that sounded almost cinematic, too grand for the banal cruelty of what he had done. But behind the nickname was something simpler and more terrifying, a man who had blended in perfectly. A neighbor. A co-worker. Someone who attended block parties, who smiled politely, who might have worn a uniform, who might have enforced the law by day and broken it by night. Speculation grew wild. Was he a cop? A military veteran? A construction worker familiar with floor plans? Each theory seemed plausible. None brought resolution. The files grew thicker. The evidence lockers fuller. Time, however, was thinning. Witnesses aged. Memories blurred. Detectives retired or died. The killer, if still alive, would be in his 70s by now. Some believed justice would never come. Yet the DNA remained, silent but patient, like the man who left it behind. In the early 2000s, cold case investigators began revisiting the evidence with renewed urgency. Forensic science had leapt forward. Tiny samples once considered unusable could now yield full profiles. The genetic fingerprint was undeniable, tying together crimes once thought isolated. Still, a profile without a name is only a ghost. Community meetings resurfaced. Survivors spoke publicly, urging authorities not to forget. Books were written. Amateur sleuths dissected timelines and geographic patterns. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Each new suspect was dissected, then discarded. The killer had lived among them for decades, perhaps raising a family, perhaps attending church, perhaps mowing his lawn every Sunday morning while his neighbors chatted over fences. The idea was suffocating. Because if he had truly stopped killing in 1986, what changed? Did age slow him? Did fear of capture grow too strong? Or did he simply decide he had taken enough? There was no confession. No deathbed admission. No fingerprint match in a routine arrest. Just silence. And the silence was its own kind of violence. Detectives described him as a man who craved power, who thrived on domination. He rehearsed his attacks. He stalked victims for weeks. He prowled neighborhoods at night, testing doors, mapping escape routes, hiding weapons in advance. He was disciplined enough to evade capture in an era before widespread surveillance, before security cameras dotted every doorway. He understood fear. He cultivated it. Even decades later, survivors could recall the sound of his breathing. The way he muttered to himself. The way he alternated between rage and eerie calm. Those details did not fade with time. As the years passed, the case became a benchmark for investigative frustration. A symbol of both the limitations and the promise of forensic science. The DNA sat in a database, waiting for a match that never came. Somewhere in California, an aging man carried the same genetic code. Unseen. Uncharged. Unafraid. The question lingered like a storm cloud over the state. How does someone commit such calculated, repeated brutality, and then simply vanish into ordinary life? In living rooms across California, old news clippings yellowed in scrapbooks. Families of victims marked anniversaries in private. Detectives revisited evidence boxes labeled with dates from the Carter administration. Every fiber, every hair, every drop of blood mattered. Because somewhere in that microscopic code was the truth. The Golden State Killer had shattered more than doors and windows. He shattered the illusion of safety in entire communities. He forced a generation to confront the reality that evil does not always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks average. Sometimes it smiles. And as the 21st century marched forward, the case refused to die. It lingered. It breathed. It waited. Like the man who started it all. The fear never really left California. It just changed shape. By the 1990s, the neighborhoods he once stalked had new paint, new fences, new families who barely remembered the headlines. Children who had been toddlers during the attacks were now adults buying homes of their own, unaware that the quiet streets of Rancho Cordova and Carmichael had once been hunting grounds. But in police archives, in battered cardboard boxes sealed with aging tape, the past remained raw. Evidence bags labeled 1976. Photographs of ransacked bedrooms. Audio tapes of trembling survivors describing the whisper in the dark. And locked inside refrigerated vaults, a biological signature that did not age. DNA. It was the one thing he could not outrun. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic laboratories began systematically retesting preserved evidence from unsolved sexual assaults and homicides. The technology was sharper now, more precise, capable of extracting full genetic profiles from samples once deemed too degraded. When technicians re-examined the Golden State crimes, the results were chillingly clear. The same male profile connected the Sacramento rapes to the Southern California murders. One predator. One lineage. One invisible thread stitching together a decade of terror. The profile was uploaded into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database designed to catch criminals who slipped through cracks, who crossed state lines, who believed time was their ally. Investigators waited for the alert that would change everything. It never came. No match. No arrest record. No felony conviction. The man responsible for more than 50 rapes and at least 13 murders had never been forced to submit his DNA. That meant something. He had avoided serious criminal charges. Or he had been careful enough to never get caught. Either way, it suggested discipline. Control. A life lived quietly. Retired Detective Richard Shelby had once hunted the East Area rapist through suburban streets, with nothing but patrol cars and radio dispatches. Now, decades later, he watched from the sidelines as younger investigators stared at computer screens and DNA charts. The methods were different. The obsession was the same. The case files were massive. Maps covered with pushpins marking attack sites. Timelines showing escalation. Notes about shoe sizes, blood types, possible military connections. The suspect had worn a mask in every confirmed assault, but witnesses remembered fragments: a narrow face, a strong jawline, light-colored hair peeking from beneath a ski mask. Too vague. Always too vague. In 2001, the attacks were formally linked under a single umbrella in the public consciousness. The name Golden State Killer gained traction in media circles, an attempt to unify the narrative. It sounded dramatic. Almost mythic. But behind the label were real people, real nights of terror. Survivors began speaking out more publicly. Some had remained silent for years, protecting their privacy, protecting their children from the horror. Now, with the suspect still unidentified, many felt a new urgency. They described the metallic smell of fear in their own homes. The way he ransacked drawers as if searching for something specific. The strange sobbing sounds he made in the dark, as if battling demons no one else could see. Was it performance? Manipulation? Genuine instability? Profilers debated endlessly. Some believed he had a background in law enforcement. The precision of his movements, the way he avoided leaving fingerprints, the timing of his attacks, often just minutes after patrol cars cleared an area, suggested inside knowledge. Others argued he was simply meticulous, a criminal who studied police behavior through observation. There were suspects. There were always suspects. Men who lived near early crime scenes. Men who owned similar weapons. Men whose ex-wives described sudden midnight disappearances or unexplained mood swings. Each lead was examined, dissected, and in the end, discarded. The frustration was suffocating. In Southern California, families of murder victims marked 20-year anniversaries without answers. Parents aged. Siblings grew old. Some died before seeing justice. Each passing year tightened the knot in investigators' stomachs. The killer, if alive, would now be approaching retirement age. Maybe he already was retired. Maybe he had grandchildren. The image was grotesque. A man who once bound couples and bludgeoned them in their beds, now possibly attending school recitals, sitting in church pews, smiling in family photographs. Cold case units refused to let go. Detectives like Paul Holes in Contra Costa County began reinvigorating the investigation in the early 2000s, combing through boxes of evidence others had nearly written off. Holes believed the answer lay not in eyewitness sketches or outdated suspect lists, but in science. The DNA profile was strong. Complete. It just needed a door to open. But CODIS required prior arrest records. The Golden State Killer had slipped through life without triggering that trap. So investigators broadened their thinking. They looked at geographic profiling, mapping every known attack to determine anchor points. The clusters suggested familiarity with certain neighborhoods, proximity to highways, possible residences during specific years. Patterns emerged. He often struck in communities with similar layouts, accessible backyards, green belts, drainage canals offering escape routes. He favored corner houses, homes backing onto open spaces. He studied architecture like a strategist studies terrain. The psychological profile painted a disturbing portrait. A man driven by anger, possibly humiliation. Someone who felt powerless in daily life, but sought dominance through calculated violence. He rehearsed his threats. He enjoyed prolonging fear. He returned to neighborhoods even after police saturated the area with patrols, as if daring them to catch him. And still, nothing concrete. In 2006, the 30-year anniversary of the first known attacks passed quietly. No press conference. No dramatic breakthroughs. Just another year added to the file. Meanwhile, the digital age exploded. Social media, online databases, amateur sleuthing communities. The case found new life on internet forums where users dissected maps and cross-referenced old yearbooks. Some theories were wild. Others surprisingly grounded. But without access to official evidence, they circled the same unanswered questions. Who was he before 1976? How did he learn to tie those knots? Why did he stop? Some speculated he moved out of state. Others believed he died in the late 1980s. A few theorized incarceration for a minor crime under a different jurisdiction. But the DNA profile stubbornly refused to match anyone in the system. The longer the silence stretched, the more haunting it became. Because silence implied success. It suggested he had gotten away with it. Detectives understood something the public often overlooked. Serial offenders rarely stop without cause. Age, imprisonment, death, or a significant life change. Marriage. Fatherhood. A career shift. Something that altered routine. If the Golden State Killer was alive, he had lived with his secrets for decades. He had watched news coverage about himself. He had heard the name. He knew the police were still searching. What did that do to a man like that? Did he feel pride? Fear? Indifference? Survivors sometimes imagined him aging in a recliner, flipping channels, pausing when a documentary mentioned his crimes. Did his heart race? Did his hands shake? Or did he simply smirk? Investigators clung to one unwavering belief: technology would eventually outpace him. By the early 2010s, genetic genealogy began emerging as a radical new frontier. The idea was simple yet revolutionary: use public ancestry databases to identify relatives of unknown suspects. If the killer himself had never submitted DNA, perhaps a distant cousin had, searching for family roots or medical history. It was controversial. Legally complex. But it represented a crack in the wall that had stood for decades. The Golden State Killer file, thick as a phone book, sat ready. The evidence had survived floods, moves, budget cuts, and administrative turnover. It had endured because someone, somewhere, believed the story was not over. And beneath the clinical language of lab reports and evidence logs, the human toll remained undeniable. More than 50 women whose lives were fractured. 13 families forever altered. Entire neighborhoods that once installed floodlights and security alarms because of one man's midnight rituals. Time had dulled the headlines, but not the impact. In quiet suburbs across California, some residents still double-checked their sliding glass doors at night, a habit passed down from parents who remembered the fear. The Golden State Killer was not just a case file. He was a shadow embedded in the state's memory. And as investigators entered a new decade armed with evolving science and relentless determination, one truth loomed larger than ever. He had left something behind. Something microscopic. Something permanent. And one day, that invisible signature would lead them straight to a name. The break did not come with flashing lights or a dramatic confession. It began quietly, in a lab, with a decision that felt almost reckless. By the mid-2010s, the Golden State Killer investigation had become a paradox, one of the most well-documented serial crime sprees in American history, yet still faceless. Detectives had the DNA. They had timelines. They had geographic patterns. What they did not have was a name. And time was running out. Many original investigators were aging. Some had already died. Survivors were entering their 60s and 70s. Every year that passed without answers felt like a betrayal. Paul Holes refused to let it die. He had spent years immersed in the evidence, chasing incremental improvements in forensic testing. He knew the DNA profile was strong enough for something more, something unconventional. The idea of genetic genealogy had been whispered in law enforcement circles, but it was largely untested in major criminal cases. The concept was simple in theory and explosive in practice. Upload the unknown suspect's DNA profile to a public genealogy database, one used by ordinary citizens searching for relatives, and see if it matched distant family members. It wasn't a direct hit they needed. Just a cousin. A second cousin. Someone connected by blood. The risk was obvious. Legal gray areas. Public backlash. Accusations of privacy violations. But the alternative was worse, letting the Golden State Killer slip into history untouched. So they moved forward. Investigators created a genetic profile formatted for genealogy comparison, and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public database where users voluntarily shared DNA results to trace ancestry. They did it quietly. No press conference. No fanfare. And then they waited. The results were not a bullseye. They were a web. Several distant relatives appeared, third cousins, fourth cousins, scattered across the United States. None of them criminals. None of them suspects. Just ordinary people, who had mailed saliva kits to ancestry companies, curious about their heritage. But in that web of distant matches lay a path. Genealogists began building family trees the old-fashioned way: census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries. They traced lines backward and outward, mapping ancestors from the 1800s forward through generations. It was painstaking. Months of research. Thousands of names. They narrowed the branches by geography. The suspect would likely have been in his 20s or 30s during the attacks in the late 1970s. That meant he would have been born roughly between the early 1940s and mid-1950s. Male. White. Lived in California during the relevant years. The tree began to shrink. One ancestral couple in particular drew attention. From them branched dozens of descendants. The genealogists tracked each line forward, eliminating women, eliminating men who were too young, too old, or clearly documented elsewhere during the crime years. The list of possibilities tightened. And then one name began to stand out. A man born in 1945. Raised in California. Former police officer. Lived in multiple areas overlapping the attack zones. Joseph James D'Angelo. He had served as a police officer in Exeter in the early 1970s, then later in Auburn, dangerously close to the early East Area rapist crime scenes. He was fired from Auburn Police Department in 1979 after being caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent. A hammer. Investigators did not celebrate. They did not jump to conclusions. They needed confirmation. The genealogy had provided a candidate, not proof. D'Angelo had never been convicted of a felony. His DNA was not in CODIS. If he was the Golden State Killer, he had evaded detection for over 4 decades. Surveillance began. By 2018, D'Angelo was in his early 70s, living quietly in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento, the very region where the nightmare had begun. He was a grandfather. A retired truck mechanic. Neighbors described him as cranky, reclusive, but unremarkable. Unremarkable. Investigators followed him discreetly. They needed his DNA, but they could not simply knock on his door and ask. They collected items he discarded, a tissue, a napkin, a piece of trash left in public. The samples were rushed to the lab. The comparison was methodical. Scientific. Cold. The DNA from the discarded items matched the profile from the 1970s crime scenes. Not partially. Not loosely. Exactly. The Golden State Killer had a name. Joseph James D'Angelo. On April 24, 2018, more than 40 years after the first known attacks, law enforcement moved in. Officers surrounded his home in Citrus Heights. There was no dramatic shootout. No attempt to flee. D'Angelo was taken into custody without resistance. Neighbors watched in disbelief as police cars lined the quiet suburban street. The elderly man who tinkered in his garage was being led away in handcuffs, accused of crimes so monstrous they felt cinematic. News broke like a thunderclap. The Golden State Killer, caught. For survivors, the moment was surreal. Some were asleep when their phones began buzzing. Others saw the headlines flash across television screens. Many cried. Some felt relief so intense it was almost painful. Others felt anger resurface, raw and immediate. The face revealed to the world was older, heavier, lined with age. But in the courtroom, as cameras zoomed in, something flickered in his eyes, a coldness, a distance that made decades collapse in an instant. Prosecutors announced charges tied to multiple counties: murder, kidnapping, sexual assault. The case spanned jurisdictions from Sacramento to Orange County. It required coordination on a scale never before attempted for a single serial offender. The arrest ignited national debate over genetic genealogy. Privacy advocates raised alarms. Law enforcement hailed it as a breakthrough. The technique that identified D'Angelo would soon solve other cold cases across the country. But in California, the focus was narrower. For 40 years, this man had lived among them. He had attended family gatherings. He had raised 3 daughters. He had mowed his lawn while neighbors waved. All while carrying the secret of at least 13 murders and more than 50 rapes. In interrogation rooms, he said little. There was no dramatic confession to detectives. No emotional unraveling. Just a quiet, aging man facing a tidal wave of evidence. The case that once symbolized frustration had transformed into something else entirely, a testament to patience, to science, to the refusal to forget. Yet even with his arrest, questions lingered. How had he balanced dual lives so seamlessly? What flipped the switch in 1986, causing the killings to stop? Did anyone suspect him? Did he ever come close to being caught? Former colleagues from his police days were stunned. Some remembered him as moody, easily angered. Others described him as competent. None publicly connected him to the monstrous crimes that unfolded in nearby counties. The arrest did not erase the trauma. It did not restore stolen years. But it punctured the myth that he was untouchable. For decades, he had been a ghost. Now he was a defendant. In court appearances, he appeared frail, almost confused at times. Defense attorneys later argued he suffered from cognitive decline. Prosecutors countered with chilling details of calculated brutality, of methodical stalking and rehearsed control. The man who once prowled through darkened hallways now shuffled into courtrooms in an orange jumpsuit. And yet, beneath the surface of this breakthrough, a deeper realization settled over California. He had not vanished. He had simply blended in. The Golden State Killer was never a supernatural phantom. He was a neighbor. A co-worker. A former cop who understood investigative procedures well enough to stay one step ahead in an era before digital footprints. His capture closed a chapter that had remained open for over 4 decades. But for those who survived his whisper in the dark, the echo would never fully fade. Because even with a name, even with handcuffs, the memory of those nights, the shattered glass, the stacked dishes, the quiet breathing in the dark, would always linger. And somewhere between relief and reckoning, California confronted an unsettling truth. The monster had been hiding in plain sight all along. The courtroom was silent the first time he spoke. Not a whisper. Not a plea. Just a frail, aging man rising slowly to his feet, shackled at the wrists, the weight of 4 decades pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. Joseph James DeAngelo. The name that had once existed only in genetic code now echoed through a packed Sacramento courtroom. Survivors filled the benches. Families of the murdered clutched photographs. Reporters leaned forward, pens trembling over notebooks. The air felt electric, heavy with something between justice and disbelief. For years, the Golden State Killer had been a myth with a pulse. Now he was a defendant with a case number. The prosecution's narrative unfolded with clinical precision. Dates. Locations. Crime scene details long sealed in evidence vaults. The language was cold, factual, but the content was anything but. Blunt force trauma. Ligatures. Sexual assault. Home invasion. Each count read aloud like a hammer striking steel. 13 murders formally charged. Dozens of rapes tied to him through DNA. Kidnapping enhancements. Special circumstances that could carry the death penalty. DeAngelo sat motionless. Survivors watched him carefully, searching for flickers of recognition, remorse, fear. Most saw none. His face remained slack, almost vacant. His shoulders stooped. He looked smaller than the legend that had haunted California for 40 years. But legends are built on actions, not posture. Behind the prosecution's calm recitation lay unspeakable violence. Couples bound together in their own beds. Women assaulted while children slept down the hall. Victims taunted with whispered threats, "I'll kill you. I'll be back." The psychological warfare had been as devastating as the physical brutality. And now, those voices returned. Victim impact statements began to pour into the court record. One by one, survivors stood and described the night that fractured their lives. Some spoke with steady voices. Others shook visibly, gripping the podium as if it were the only solid object in a collapsing room. They described waking to a flashlight beam in their eyes. The metallic taste of terror. The sound of plates stacked on a husband's back as a warning system. The humiliation. The years of therapy. The marriages that crumbled under the weight of trauma. He listened. Or at least he appeared to. The murders were even harder to absorb. Parents of slain daughters described empty chairs at holidays. Siblings spoke of decades spent imagining what life might have looked like if a masked intruder had not slipped through a sliding glass door. The courtroom became a confessional for 40 years of suppressed grief. Outside, media vans lined the streets. The arrest had reignited national fascination. Documentaries were commissioned. Podcasts dissected timelines. The case became a benchmark for forensic genealogy, the method that had finally cornered him. But inside the courtroom, the focus was not on science. It was on impact. Prosecutors faced a logistical labyrinth. The crime spanned multiple counties: Sacramento, Ventura, Orange, Santa Barbara. Each jurisdiction had its own charges, its own district attorney. Coordinating a unified strategy required unprecedented collaboration. The death penalty loomed in the background, but legal complexities and the defendant's age complicated everything. DeAngelo was in his 70s. Trials could stretch for years. Survivors, many now elderly themselves, might not live to see a verdict. Behind closed doors, negotiations began. The evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA linked him irrefutably to the rapes and murders. Old police reports aligned with his employment history. His time as an officer in Auburn overlapped chillingly with early attack locations. The geographic patterns fit like a glove. The defense faced a mountain too steep to climb. In 2020, a plea agreement took shape. DeAngelo would plead guilty to multiple counts of murder and kidnapping. He would admit to dozens of uncharged rapes. In exchange, he would avoid the death penalty and receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For some families, it felt like a compromise. For others, it was pragmatic, a way to secure accountability without risking decades of appeals. The day he entered his plea, the courtroom felt suspended in time. Count after count was read aloud. Murder in the first degree. Kidnapping for the purpose of robbery. Each time, the judge asked for his response. Guilty. The word emerged in a low, almost mechanical voice. Again and again. Guilty. There was no dramatic confession, no elaboration, no apology at first. Just a steady acknowledgement of crimes that had once seemed unsolvable. Then, in a brief, almost surreal moment, he spoke beyond the single-word responses. "I've listened to all your statements," he said quietly. "Each one of them. And I'm truly sorry for everyone I've hurt." The statement was brief. Controlled. Some survivors rejected it outright. After decades of silence, after years of living under the weight of his violence, an apology felt insufficient, almost insulting. But the legal process moved forward. In August 2020, sentencing took place in a ballroom converted into a socially distanced courtroom due to the global pandemic. Even a virus could not delay this reckoning any longer. Survivors once again faced him, this time knowing the outcome was sealed. Life without parole. The judge's voice was steady as he imposed multiple consecutive life sentences, ensuring DeAngelo would die behind bars. No chance of release. No sunlight beyond prison walls. No return to suburban anonymity. For the first time since 1976, the Golden State Killer was fully contained. Yet the closure was complex. Many survivors described feeling lighter, as if a shadow had finally lifted. Others felt a strange emptiness. For decades, the hunt had defined part of their emotional landscape. The mystery had been a constant companion, terrible but persistent. Now it was resolved, but the scars remained. Communities across California revisited their history. Old newspaper clippings resurfaced. Retired detectives reflected publicly on missed opportunities, on near misses that could have ended the spree earlier. There were moments in the 1970s when patrol officers had been blocks away from his prowling. Moments when composite sketches bore unsettling resemblance to men no one suspected. The case also triggered national conversations about privacy and forensic innovation. Genetic genealogy was no longer experimental. It had proven its power. Other cold cases began to fall as investigators adopted the same method, tracing family trees to expose killers who believed time had erased them. But beneath the broader implications lay something more intimate. A state had carried this fear for over 40 years. A generation had grown up checking locks twice because of him. Parents had taught children cautionary lessons rooted in his crimes. His shadow had stretched far beyond the victims he directly attacked. Now, that shadow had a face. Aging. Ordinary. Human. And that was perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. He had not been a monster in appearance. He had not lived in isolation, or exhibited obvious signs of savagery. He had blended into PTA meetings, neighborhood conversations, hardware stores. The capacity for calculated brutality had coexisted with mundane domestic life. That duality forced a reckoning far deeper than the legal outcome. Because if someone like Joseph James DeAngelo could hide in plain sight for decades, what did that say about the masks people wear every day? As he was led away to begin his life sentence, there was no applause. No cinematic swell of music. Just a quiet exhale from a courtroom that had waited 40 years to breathe again. The Golden State Killer was no longer a ghost. He was inmate number XXXXXX, locked inside a concrete cell. But the echoes of shattered glass, whispered threats, and sleepless suburban nights would never fully disappear. They lingered in memory. In caution. In the knowledge that justice, though delayed, had finally caught up. And in California, the doors that once felt fragile in the dark began, slowly, to feel solid again. Long after the sentencing, after the cameras packed up and the headlines faded into archives, the question refused to die. How did he stop? Serial predators do not simply wake up one morning and decide to become ordinary. They escalate. They spiral. They fracture. And yet in 1986, after the murder in Irvine, the Golden State Killer vanished from the crime map as abruptly as he had appeared. No final taunt. No farewell call. No signature left behind to mark the end. Just silence. Investigators revisited the timeline again, this time with the suspect's full biography laid beside the crime charts. Joseph James DeAngelo. Born 1945. Navy veteran. Police officer. Fired for shoplifting in 1979. Married. 3 daughters. Divorced later in life, but still closely connected to family. When the killings stopped in 1986, something else had happened that year. His youngest daughter was born. The detail struck many as chilling. Could fatherhood have tempered him? Redirected him? Or had the risk simply grown too high as forensic science improved and neighborhoods became more vigilant? There was no confession explaining the shift. No psychological roadmap. Inside prison, he retreated into silence once more. No interviews. No detailed admissions beyond the courtroom pleas. He did not grant the world the narrative it craved. And so the speculation continued. Former colleagues from his Auburn Police Department days looked back with uneasy clarity. DeAngelo had once arrested shoplifters for petty theft, the same crime that ended his law enforcement career when he was caught stealing a hammer and dog repellent from a Sacramento store. A hammer. The weapon often suspected in the bludgeonings. It was a detail too precise to ignore, yet too small to fully explain the abyss between petty theft and calculated murder. Neighbors in Citrus Heights described him as volatile. He yelled. He argued. Police had been called to his house for domestic disturbances. But nothing in public records hinted at the scale of violence buried beneath. That was the unsettling truth, his darkness had compartments. He could rage in private. He could control in secret. And by daylight, he could blend into routine. Investigators also studied his movements after 1986. He worked as a truck mechanic for decades. A blue-collar job. Predictable hours. Steady income. He lived in the same modest home for years, only miles from some of his earliest attack sites. He had returned to the epicenter of his crimes and simply stayed there. The audacity was staggering. For survivors, that detail cut deeply. While they relocated, installed alarm systems, and carried trauma across state lines, he remained rooted in the soil of his offenses, tending a yard, fixing engines, attending family events. The geography of it all felt like a final insult. And yet, when forensic psychologists examined his known behaviors, they saw patterns consistent with a man who thrived on risk during youth, but adapted with age. Testosterone declines. Physical stamina fades. The logistics of subduing couples become harder for a man in his 40s, then 50s. Perhaps biology slowed him. Perhaps fear did. By the mid-1980s, DNA technology was emerging, even if primitive. Media coverage had intensified. Task forces were coordinating more aggressively across counties. The net was tightening, even if invisibly. Maybe he sensed it. Maybe the birth of another child tethered him to domestic life in a way that altered his calculus. The presence of a newborn in his own house may have disrupted the psychological rituals that fueled his violence. Or maybe he simply felt satisfied. That possibility was the most disturbing of all. In prison, D'Angelo reportedly lived quietly, rarely interacting. Age had carved deep lines into his face. He used a wheelchair at times. The image of frailty contrasted sharply with crime scene photographs from the 1970s, photographs that still made seasoned detectives avert their eyes. Survivors often wrestled with conflicting emotions upon seeing him aged and diminished. Some felt empowered. Others felt cheated. The man who once controlled every second of their terror now appeared weak, almost fragile. But fragility did not erase memory. In interviews after sentencing, several survivors described a strange shift. For decades, they had imagined a shadowy, ageless predator, a figure frozen in his 30s, muscular, agile, breathing through clenched teeth in the dark. Now that image had been replaced by an elderly inmate behind bars. The myth had collapsed into flesh. Yet the psychological imprint remained unchanged. Many still slept lightly. Still startled at sudden noises. Trauma does not expire with a guilty plea. The Golden State Killer case also left behind a blueprint for modern investigations. Genetic genealogy exploded across the country. Cold cases that had languished for decades suddenly cracked open. Names were pulled from obscurity. Arrests followed. But each success carried ethical debates. Privacy advocates warned of slippery slopes. Could innocent relatives inadvertently expose family members? Where should the line be drawn between public safety and genetic autonomy? The D'Angelo arrest had set a precedent. It proved that time was no longer a reliable shield for violent offenders. 4 retired detectives, who had chased him through Sacramento streets in the 1970s, the arrest felt almost surreal. They remembered patrolling neighborhoods on summer nights, windows down, searching for a masked prowler who moved like smoke between houses. They had been so close at times. In 1977, an officer spotted a suspicious man fleeing through a backyard. A chase ensued. Gunfire was exchanged. The suspect escaped into darkness. Years later, investigators would revisit that report with a new lens, wondering if the fleeing figure had been D'Angelo himself. So many near misses. So many almosts. The passage of time does not soften those memories. It sharpens them. For California, the case became both a warning and a reassurance. A warning that evil can hide behind routine. A reassurance that science, persistence, and refusal to forget can eventually pierce even the most carefully constructed mask. In quiet suburban streets where he once prowled, families now install doorbell cameras and motion lights, without remembering why such precautions once became popular. Security culture evolved partly because of men like him. The legacy is invisible but embedded. And perhaps that is the final layer of this story, not just the crimes, not just the arrest, but the transformation of an entire investigative era. The Golden State Killer began his spree in a time before DNA, before digital databases, before online genealogy. He exploited fragmentation and analog systems. He relied on jurisdictional silos and slow communication. He was a predator perfectly suited for the 1970s. But he was caught in the 21st century. Caught not by a dramatic tip or a sudden confession, but by the slow, relentless march of science and a handful of investigators who refused to let his name remain unknown. Even now, in a prison cell, he offers no detailed explanation. No psychological roadmap for his descent. The silence persists. But the silence no longer protects him. It belongs to the courtroom now. To the archives. To the record of history that will forever tie Joseph James D'Angelo to the title that once sounded like folklore. Golden State Killer. A name that once represented a ghost. Now it represents a man who ran out of time. There is a sound survivors never forget. Not the shattering glass. Not the footsteps in the hallway. Not even the whispered threats. It's the waiting. The seconds stretched into hours while he moved through their homes, opening drawers, flipping light switches, standing in doorways just long enough to remind them he was still there. The waiting was a weapon. Time bent around him. Minutes felt like suffocation. Decades later, that same distortion of time defined the investigation itself. For 40 years, the Golden State Killer existed in suspension, neither caught nor gone, neither myth nor memory. A presence that lingered in police files and in the backs of minds. Even after the arrest, even after the guilty pleas, there remained a haunting question that no courtroom could answer. Who was he before the mask? Joseph James D'Angelo's childhood offered fragments, but no clear blueprint. Born in 1945, raised in a working-class family, one of several siblings. He served in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam era. Those who knew him in his youth described flashes of temper, competitiveness, a simmering intensity. Nothing that screamed future serial predator. Nothing that forecasted the meticulous cruelty that would follow. But serial violence rarely announces itself early. He married young. Started a family. Pursued law enforcement, a profession built on authority and control. As a police officer in Exeter and later Auburn, he learned procedure. He learned response times. He learned how evidence was collected, how crime scenes were processed, how mistakes were made. That knowledge would become armor. During the height of the East Area rapist attacks, he was patrolling streets by day and prowling them by night. The duality feels almost cinematic, but it was real. He attended briefings about a predator he secretly was. He heard colleagues discuss tactics to catch him. He absorbed every adjustment in patrol strategy. And then he adapted. When neighborhoods increased lighting, he moved through shadows. When police set up decoys, he shifted geography. When composite sketches circulated, he changed grooming habits. Control was everything. Psychologists who later studied his case noted his ritualistic patterns, the pre-attack surveillance, the rehearsed threats, the binding methods that immobilized couples while maximizing psychological terror. He derived not only physical gratification, but emotional domination. The power to invade. The power to humiliate. The power to leave survivors alive, but altered forever. It was not chaos. It was choreography. And yet, behind that precision, there were cracks. Victims recalled moments when he seemed frantic, almost panicked. He muttered to himself. He wept softly at times. He spoke of financial troubles, of a girlfriend who left him, of a life that had disappointed him. Whether those confessions were genuine or manipulative is impossible to know. But they hint at something deeper. A man battling internal storms while constructing external control. When he was fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting, the dismissal was humiliating. Public. A fracture in the identity he had built. That same year marked a shift in his crimes, from serial sexual assault to murder. The escalation was not subtle. Couples were bludgeoned with ferocity. The violence became terminal. The risk intensified. It was as if losing his badge stripped away restraint, exposing something darker beneath. And still, he evaded capture. Looking back with modern clarity, investigators now see moments that shimmer with tragic irony. Traffic stops near crime scenes. Reports of prowlers matching his physical build. The 1977 backyard chase, where an officer exchanged gunfire with a fleeing suspect who disappeared into night. What if that suspect had stumbled? What if backup had arrived seconds sooner? What if one patrol car had turned down a different street? History balances on such fragile hinges. After his arrest, former colleagues replayed old memories with uneasy hindsight. Arguments. Explosive reactions over minor slights. An intensity that felt disproportionate. None of it proof. But enough to make the past feel heavier. Forensic experts also revisited the crime scenes with renewed perspective. The way he pre-tied ligatures and hid them in advance. The strategic placement of stolen bicycles for silent escape. The use of dog repellent to neutralize barking alarms before they could alert neighbors. These were not impulsive acts. They were rehearsed operations. And yet, despite decades of analysis, the inner core remains elusive. What truly ignited him? What first impulse tipped into obsession? Was it rejection? Resentment? A need for supremacy born from perceived inadequacy? Serial killers often leave behind manifestos, letters, some distorted philosophy. D'Angelo left nothing. No writings discovered. No detailed interviews. No attempt to justify. Just silence. That silence forces the narrative back to the victims, where it always belonged. Women who rebuilt careers while carrying invisible scars. Couples who redefined intimacy after trauma. Families who grew up with an empty chair at the dinner table because a masked intruder ended a life mid-dream. Their resilience stands in stark contrast to his secrecy. In prison, his world shrank to concrete walls and routine counts. The man who once controlled entire households with whispered threats now followed institutional schedules. Lights out. Meal times. Head counts. The reversal is almost poetic. Yet justice, even served, does not rewind time. The neighborhoods he terrorized have changed. Trees have grown taller. Houses have been remodeled. Children who once slept unaware during attacks are now grandparents themselves. But memory lingers in subtle ways, in extra locks installed decades ago that were never removed, in stories shared cautiously between longtime residents. The Golden State Killer reshaped how communities think about vulnerability. He also reshaped law enforcement. The case exposed the limitations of fragmented jurisdictions in the 1970s. It underscored the necessity of data sharing, of centralized databases, of cross-county collaboration. Modern task forces cite his case as a lesson written in blood, the cost of siloed information. And above all, his capture proved something profound: time no longer guarantees escape. In an era of expanding forensic science, of digital footprints and genetic trails, the illusion of permanent anonymity has eroded. Criminals who once believed decades could bury them now face a different reality. Somewhere, in evidence lockers across the country, DNA waits patiently. Just as his once did. The Golden State Killer began as a whisper in suburban dark. He evolved into a headline, a cautionary tale, a ghost story told at community meetings. And finally, he became a defendant, a prisoner, a case study. But beyond the labels lies a harder truth. He was not supernatural. He was not unstoppable. He was not a phantom. He was a man who exploited gaps in systems, in communication, in trust. And when those gaps closed, when science bridged distance and time, the mask finally slipped. Yet even now, in the quiet after conviction, the story resists simplicity. Because closure is not the same as erasure. Survivors carry echoes. Families carry anniversaries. Detectives carry memories of nights spent chasing shadows. The waiting is over. But the remembering continues. There is a moment in every long hunt when the myth becomes heavier than the man. For decades, the Golden State Killer was larger than life, a silhouette stretching across California's map, a composite sketch taped to bulletin boards, a phantom blamed for every creak in the night. He was the reason porch lights stayed on. The reason sliding glass doors were reinforced. The reason parents checked on their children twice before going to bed. Then the myth collapsed into a driveway in Citrus Heights. A frail, gray-haired man in handcuffs. And suddenly, the question shifted from who is he to something far more unsettling. How many times did we pass him in a grocery store? After the arrest, journalists descended on the neighborhood. They knocked on doors. They asked the same question over and over: did you suspect anything? The answers were eerily consistent. He was quiet. He kept to himself. Kind of cranky. Just an old guy. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing monstrous. One neighbor recalled him shouting profanities in his backyard, angry and volatile. Another remembered him meticulously tending to his lawn. Someone else described seeing him working on motorcycles in his garage late into the evening. Ordinary fragments. The kind that blend into suburban background noise. But behind those garage doors, behind that modest facade, lived a man who once tied couples together and whispered death threats into the dark. The dissonance is difficult to absorb. Psychologists call it compartmentalization, the ability to separate identities so completely that one life does not contaminate the other. D'Angelo appears to have mastered it. By night in the 1970s and 80s, he was methodical, predatory, fueled by domination. By day, he attended family functions, paid bills, raised daughters. The human mind resists that duality. We prefer villains who look like villains. Faces that signal danger. Personalities that scream instability. He offered none of that. His daughters released brief public statements after the arrest, expressing shock and heartbreak. They described a father, not a monster. A complicated man, yes, but not the architect of terror detailed in court records. Imagine discovering that the person who tucked you into bed once broke into other homes and shattered lives. The psychological fallout ripples outward. Former co-workers from his decades as a truck mechanic struggled with similar disbelief. They remembered arguments, temper flashes, a man who could be abrasive. But murder. Serial rape. The scale felt impossible. And yet the DNA did not lie. The evidence told a story too precise to dispute. Biological samples preserved for 40 years matched him exactly. Crime scene details aligned with his movements. His employment history intersected with attack zones like coordinates on a map. He had hidden in plain sight, not through brilliance alone, but through predictability. He paid his mortgage. He showed up to work. He aged. Time became his camouflage. As the legal process unfolded, another layer of reckoning began, inside law enforcement itself. Retired detectives revisited old decisions with a mixture of pride and regret. Pride that they had preserved evidence carefully enough for future technology to unlock it. Regret that they had not connected dots sooner. In the 1970s, information moved slowly. Counties guarded files. Databases were primitive. A serial predator could cross jurisdictional lines and fracture the investigative trail. He exploited that fragmentation ruthlessly. Today, investigators share data across state lines within seconds. DNA databases sync nationally. Surveillance cameras blanket neighborhoods. It is tempting to believe someone like him could not operate the same way now. But that belief carries danger. Every era has its blind spots. The Golden State Killer thrived in an analog world, paper files, landline phones, patrol cars relying on radio dispatch. He used stolen bicycles to move silently, discarded them in canals to erase evidence. He studied routine, mapped neighborhoods, and struck when vulnerability peaked. Modern predators may exploit different gaps: digital anonymity, encrypted communication, technological overload. The lesson is not that evil disappears with innovation. It adapts. And adaptation is what he did best. Even his silence after arrest was strategic. He offered minimal commentary, no detailed confessions, no psychological unraveling for public consumption. By withholding narrative, he retained a final sliver of control. Survivors, however, reclaimed the microphone. During sentencing, dozens spoke for hours, describing the before and after of their lives. Some addressed him directly, refusing to use his name. Others stared at him, searching for humanity behind his eyes. One survivor described sleeping with a loaded gun for years. Another recounted how she would still freeze at the sound of footsteps behind her, decades after the attack. A husband described the crushing guilt of being bound and unable to protect his wife. These testimonies transformed the courtroom into something beyond legal procedure. It became a ledger of endurance. He had taken moments. He had taken innocence. He had taken lives. But he had not erased voices. Outside the courtroom, the world consumed the story as true crime spectacle. Documentaries replayed grainy footage from the 1970s. Dramatic music underscored reenactments of prowlers slipping through backyards. The nickname, Golden State Killer, echoed across streaming platforms. There is an uncomfortable tension there. For survivors, this was not entertainment. It was lived reality. Yet exposure also meant acknowledgement. Their pain was no longer a forgotten footnote in old newspapers. It was recognized, documented, preserved in history. Meanwhile, in a prison cell, the man once known only by a sinister moniker adjusted to institutional life. Guards described him as quiet, withdrawn, aging rapidly. The body that once vaulted fences and outrun officers now relied on routine medical care. The voice that once whispered threats now answered to correctional commands. Power had inverted. Still, some questions remain locked away with him. Did he watch the news coverage of his arrest and feel fear for the first time? Did he anticipate that genealogy would undo him? Did he ever suspect that a distant relative's curiosity about ancestry would expose his secret? Perhaps he underestimated the future. Perhaps he believed the 1970s would remain sealed in the 1970s. He was wrong. The collapse of his anonymity signaled something seismic. The past is no longer static. Evidence preserved decades ago can awaken. DNA does not forget. For California, the case is now etched into history textbooks and criminology courses. It represents both terror and triumph, a reminder of vulnerability and of perseverance. But beyond academic study, beyond headlines, there is a quieter truth. Some nights, even after sentencing, survivors still wake to phantom sounds. A creak in the hallway. A shift of wind against a window pane. Trauma imprints deeply, rewiring instinct. Justice can cage a man. It cannot fully silence memory. And so the story of the Golden State Killer exists in layers, myth dismantled, science victorious, communities scarred but standing. A monster unmasked. A neighbor exposed. A ghost turned human. Yet in the dark spaces of memory, the echo of his footsteps still lingers, softer now, but never entirely gone. Even after the handcuffs. Even after the guilty pleas. Even after the life sentences stacked one on top of another like concrete walls. There were still rooms in this story that felt unfinished. Because the arrest answered who, but it never fully answered why. Investigators combed back through every documented attack, not searching for a suspect anymore, but for insight. Patterns that once served identification now served understanding. The spacing between crimes. The escalation curve. The cooling off periods. The geographic drift from Northern California rapes to Southern California murders. It read like a transformation. From prowler to predator to executioner. In the early East Area rapist attacks, he left victims alive. Traumatized, yes. Shattered, yes. But alive. Control was the objective. Domination was the currency. He lingered. He whispered. He wanted them conscious, aware, terrified. Then something shifted. When the murders began in 1979, the tempo changed. The violence sharpened. Bludgeoning replaced prolonged captivity. The crimes were faster, more terminal. He still bound couples. Still invaded bedrooms. But the final act was no longer departure. It was annihilation. Was it rage? Escalation? A perceived loss of power elsewhere in life that demanded more extreme assertion. The firing from Auburn Police Department sits at the center of that timeline like a psychological fracture. Public disgrace. Stripped authority. The loss of a badge, a symbol of power. Within months, the crimes turned lethal. Coincidence feels too soft a word. Profilers have long theorized that serial offenders often escalate when personal identity destabilizes. If law enforcement gave him structure and superiority, losing it may have detonated something volatile inside him. But theory can only reach so far. Inside prison, he offered no manifesto. No detailed confession. No roadmap through his own darkness. When psychiatrists evaluated him, they saw traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder. Narcissism. A lack of empathy. A need for dominance. None of it unique. What made him extraordinary was endurance. 10 years of active predation. Dozens of crime scenes. Multiple counties. Zero identification for over 4 decades. That longevity required discipline. He studied patrol routes. He memorized neighborhood layouts. He used canals and greenbelts as escape corridors. He parked strategically. He wore gloves. He removed light bulbs from outdoor fixtures before entering homes. He was not improvising. He was rehearsing. And then there were the phone calls. Months after assaults, sometimes years, he would call survivors and whisper their names. Proof that he remembered. Proof that he still watched. That lingering psychological tether may have been as devastating as the physical crime itself. Survivors never knew when the phone might ring. Never knew if he might return. Even after his arrest, some admitted that answering unknown numbers still sent a pulse of dread through their bodies. That is the true lifespan of a crime, not the moment of attack, but the decades of echo. When news of his capture spread globally, another wave followed. Other cold case units began re-examining unsolved assaults from the same era, wondering if more victims existed beyond confirmed counts. Could there have been additional crimes not linked by DNA? Attacks unreported due to shame or fear? The possibility remains. Serial predators rarely limit themselves neatly to official tallies. Investigators also questioned whether he committed crimes outside California. He had Navy service. He traveled. But without preserved DNA evidence in other jurisdictions, speculation remains just that, speculation. The confirmed record is already staggering. More than 50 sexual assaults. At least 13 murders. Over 100 burglaries. Numbers that strain comprehension. Yet behind every statistic is a bedroom. A hallway. A human being jolted awake by a flashlight beam in the dark. In interviews following the sentencing, some survivors described an unexpected emotion, anger at how long he lived freely. 40 years of birthdays. Holidays. Ordinary mornings drinking coffee while newspapers occasionally mentioned unsolved cold case. He aged in peace while they aged in vigilance. The imbalance feels almost cruel. And yet, when the genealogical match finally exposed him, it happened not because he slipped, but because the world evolved. A distant relative's curiosity about ancestry became the crack in his armor. A digital database bridged decades. A forensic technique no one imagined in 1976 erased the illusion of permanence. He did not outsmart the future. The future simply caught up. That shift has altered criminal psychology forever. The old calculation, commit crime, avoid immediate capture, disappear into time, no longer guarantees safety. DNA persists. Databases expand. Family trees intertwine. Somewhere, a cousin uploads saliva to learn about heritage, unaware that buried within that data could be a thread leading to long-forgotten violence. The Golden State Killer case marked a threshold. Before him, genetic genealogy was experimental. After him, it became mainstream investigative strategy. But the science, as groundbreaking as it was, cannot explain the human void at the center. What allows a man to kneel beside a bound couple and whisper threats while their children sleep in the next room? What internal narrative justifies that invasion? He carried those answers into prison. And silence remains his final defense. Perhaps that silence is deliberate, one last assertion of control. By refusing to explain, he denies the world closure on his own terms. He forces interpretation. Forces speculation. But closure does not belong to him anymore. It belongs to survivors who reclaimed their voices. To detectives who preserved evidence when budgets were thin and hope thinner. To communities that endured fear without surrendering entirely to it. The Golden State Killer once dictated the rhythm of neighborhoods, when lights were turned off, when patrols were scheduled, when fear spiked. Now, his existence is reduced to a case study, a cautionary tale, a prisoner number. Yet the psychological landscape he reshaped remains altered. Security systems became standard. DNA databases expanded. Law enforcement protocols shifted toward collaboration. The legacy of his violence extended beyond victims into institutional reform. It is a paradox. From devastation emerged innovation. Still, innovation cannot erase memory. Some survivors have chosen to forgive, not for his sake, but for their own liberation. Others reject forgiveness entirely, choosing instead to hold anger as a testament to what was taken. Both responses are valid. Because trauma is not linear. As night falls across California now, the suburbs he once stalked look peaceful. Lawns trimmed. Windows glowing warmly. Children asleep under soft blankets. The difference is subtle but profound. The predator, who once moved between those houses, is gone. Not vanished into myth. Not dissolved into rumor. Gone behind steel bars. And yet, somewhere in the quiet, in that thin space between memory and sleep, there is still an echo, a reminder of how easily ordinary streets once became hunting grounds. The story is no longer unsolved. But its imprint remains. Deep. Permanent. Unforgettable. There was a time when detectives measured progress in inches. A partial shoe print in a flower bed. A fiber caught on a window frame. A neighbor who thought they saw a shadow move along a fence line. In the 1970s, that was the battlefield. Flashlights. Notebooks. Patrol cars idling under sodium vapor streetlights. The Golden State Killer operated in an era where darkness truly meant darkness. No doorbell cameras, no GPS data, no cell phone pings to reconstruct movement. He exploited that void completely. When modern investigators revisited the case after his arrest, they did something unexpected. They walked the old neighborhoods again, not as hunters this time, but as historians. They traced the routes he likely took. The canals he used for escape. The narrow green belts that cut behind rows of houses like secret corridors. Standing there decades later, the scale felt intimate. These were not sprawling wildernesses. They were suburban grids. Playgrounds. Cul-de-sacs where children rode bicycles in daylight. And at night, he turned them into staging grounds. Former patrol officers recalled the exhaustion of those years. The endless reports. The pressure from terrified residents. The sensation of chasing a figure who always seemed one block ahead. One officer remembered responding to a prowler call just minutes after an assault occurred. The suspect had vanished into darkness, leaving behind only ligatures and shattered trust. Another described how the department once believed they had him cornered after a series of clustered attacks. Patrols were saturated. Decoys were deployed. For weeks, nothing happened. Then he struck in another county. Jurisdictional lines were invisible to him, but concrete to law enforcement. That fragmentation was his ally. Each county maintained separate evidence systems, separate suspect lists, separate communication chains. By the time patterns were fully recognized across regions, years had passed. Today, analysts can overlay crime data across states in seconds. Back then, connecting dots meant physically comparing files, manually reviewing reports, hoping someone noticed similarities. He thrived in delay. But the delay also preserved something critical: evidence. Crime scene technicians in the 1970s meticulously collected biological samples, even though DNA testing did not yet exist. They froze evidence, catalogued it, stored it carefully. They believed someday science might advance enough to extract answers. That belief became prophetic. Without those preserved samples, the genealogical breakthrough would have been impossible. Without careful evidence retention, Joseph James DeAngelo would have died an anonymous neighbor. It is a quiet heroism, the unseen discipline of evidence storage, that ultimately unmasked him. When the genealogical tree narrowed to his branch, surveillance teams operated with surgical caution. They could not risk tipping him off. A suspect who once evaded capture for decades could still flee, destroy evidence, harm someone else. Officers watched him shop for groceries. Watched him step outside to retrieve mail. Watched him move slowly, older now, heavier. The contrast must have been surreal for the investigators, knowing the history attached to that ordinary figure. When they retrieved his discarded DNA from trash, they handled it with the gravity of something sacred. Because inside that sample was confirmation that the ghost was flesh. The lab results came back with mathematical certainty. Match. After 40 years of speculation, after thousands of suspect names crossed off lists, after countless sleepless nights for victims and detectives alike, the answer had been sitting in a quiet suburban house all along. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic in execution. No dramatic chase. No resistance. He was taken without incident. But emotionally, it detonated. Survivors described collapsing into tears when they heard the news. Some felt vindicated. Others felt rage surge back to the surface. For decades, they had built coping mechanisms around uncertainty. Suddenly, uncertainty evaporated. A face replaced the mask. A name replaced the nickname. The psychological shift was profound. During sentencing, prosecutors read statements detailing each known murder. The names echoed in the courtroom like tolling bells. Lyman and Charlene Smith. Brian and Katie Majori. Keith and Patrice Harrington. Manuela Whitton. And others whose lives ended mid-sentence, mid-dream. 13 confirmed dead. The courtroom air thickened with memory. DeAngelo's brief apology did little to soften the weight. "I'm truly sorry," he said. 4 words against 40 years. For many, it was too little, too late. Yet justice, even imperfect, closed a door that had remained open for half a century. After sentencing, criminologists began dissecting the case not just as history, but as evolution. They studied how he selected victims, often targeting couples with specific layouts, homes with accessible escape paths. They examined his escalation timeline, noting how cooling-off periods lengthened toward the end. Was it aging? Fatigue? Increased domestic responsibilities? His youngest daughter's birth in 1986 remains a haunting milestone. After that, no confirmed murders. Some experts believe fatherhood altered his psychological equilibrium. Others argue the risk calculus changed as forensic awareness grew. There is no confession to confirm either theory. That absence keeps a small part of the case unresolved, not legally, but psychologically. Because understanding motive offers a different kind of closure. Without it, we are left with behavior patterns and educated inference. And perhaps that is fitting. He spent his criminal life denying victims control. In the end, he denies the world a full explanation. But the narrative no longer belongs to him. It belongs to those who endured. One survivor described looking directly at him in court and realizing something unexpected: he looked small. Not powerful. Not terrifying. Just old. That realization stripped away the last fragment of myth. For decades, he had occupied a supernatural space in collective imagination. The man who could appear anywhere. The man who vanished into air. The man who outsmarted everyone. In reality, he was human. Flawed. Aging. Vulnerable to the same inevitabilities as anyone else. Time did not protect him forever. It simply delayed accountability. Today, the streets he once prowled are quieter in a different way. Not because danger has vanished from the world, but because this particular chapter is closed. The Golden State Killer is no longer a question mark. He is a case study in patience, in perseverance, in the convergence of science and memory. But at night, when lights go out and houses settle into silence, there remains a faint awareness, a cultural memory woven into California's suburbs. Locks checked twice. Curtains drawn carefully. A reminder that safety can be fragile. And that even the longest shadows eventually meet the dawn. In the aftermath of the sentencing, the headlines began to fade. But the ripple effects did not. Inside forensic laboratories across the United States, conversations shifted. The arrest of the Golden State Killer wasn't just the capture of a long-hunted predator, it was proof of concept. Investigators realized they were standing at the edge of a new era. Genetic genealogy was no longer theoretical. It had teeth. Within months, cold case units from Florida to Washington began reviewing unsolved files with renewed urgency. Biological evidence that had sat frozen for decades was thawed, catalogued, tested again with modern sequencing techniques. Names long written in pencil were rewritten in ink. The success in California triggered a wave. Detectives revisited cases once deemed unsolvable. And in city after city, announcements followed, decades-old murders linked to suspects identified through distant cousins, family trees, discarded coffee cups. For families who had stopped expecting answers, the phone began to ring again. But the method also ignited controversy. Civil liberties advocates questioned the boundaries. Millions of people had uploaded DNA profiles to genealogy databases to find relatives, not to help law enforcement. The ethical line blurred. When you share your genetic code, how far does that access extend? Some databases changed their policies, requiring users to opt in before law enforcement could search their data. Others restricted access entirely. The debate grew louder. Privacy versus justice. Protection versus prosecution. The Golden State Killer case sat squarely in the center of that argument. In Sacramento, community forums filled with residents asking whether the ends justified the means. Survivors stood and spoke about fear that had lasted half a lifetime. Many argued that if a distant cousin's curiosity about ancestry led to justice, it was worth it. Others worried about the precedent. The law struggled to keep pace with science. Meanwhile, Joseph James DeAngelo was transferred into the prison system, his world reduced to concrete walls and routine. No parole. No release date. The rest of his life measured in institutional time. For some survivors, that was enough. For others, closure was more complicated. Trauma does not evaporate when a gavel falls. Many described unexpected emotional aftershocks. Nightmares resurfaced. Memories sharpened. The face in court replaced the faceless intruder in dreams. Some sought therapy for the first time in decades. Others reconnected with fellow survivors, forming support networks that felt long overdue. In a strange way, the arrest reopened wounds before allowing them to heal properly. One woman said she had built her entire adult identity around resilience, around surviving something unspeakable. When the case was solved, she had to confront who she was beyond that survival story. Justice reshaped identity. The case also forced law enforcement to reckon with its own past limitations. Retired officers admitted frustration at mistakes made in the 1970s, missed connections, slow communication between counties, incomplete suspect vetting. But they also defended the context of the time. Technology matters. Data sharing matters. Funding matters. The Golden State Killer exploited cracks in the system that have since been reinforced, though not perfectly. And still, there is an unsettling truth: if not for the digital age, he may never have been identified. He might have died quietly, his crimes locked behind a false sense of safety. That reality lingers. In classrooms where criminology is taught, the case now occupies multiple chapters. It is studied as serial offender psychology, as investigative evolution, as forensic revolution, as ethical dilemma. Few cases carry so many layers. The name Golden State Killer has become shorthand for something larger, the idea that time is no longer the sanctuary it once was for offenders. Cold cases are no longer static files gathering dust. They are dormant, waiting for the next technological leap. And yet, experts caution against overconfidence. Genetic genealogy works best when DNA is preserved and databases are large enough to create meaningful connections. It is not a magic wand. It is a tool, powerful, but dependent on circumstance. Not every cold case will have a breakthrough. That reality tempers the optimism. Still, the psychological impact on criminals cannot be ignored. Investigators report that suspects in decades-old crimes have begun confessing, aware that a distant relative's DNA kit could someday expose them. Fear has shifted direction. For decades, communities feared the unknown predator in the dark. Now, aging perpetrators may fear the invisible net of data tightening around them. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of this case. Not just the capture of one man, but the transformation of possibility. Somewhere tonight, in a quiet evidence locker, boxes labeled with fading ink remain sealed. Inside them are fragments of lives interrupted, fibers, swabs, photographs, reports typed on machines long obsolete. They wait. The Golden State Killer case proved that waiting does not mean forgotten. It proved that even after 40 years, a knock on the door is still possible. And for victims who believed the world had moved on without answers, that knock changed everything. Time, once an accomplice to crime, became an ally to justice. And in that reversal lies the true shock, not just that he was caught, but that patience, science, and relentless memory finally caught up to the man who thought he had outrun them all. Long before the arrest, before the DNA match, before the genealogy databases and courtroom apologies, there was a different kind of silence. The silence inside the homes he left behind. In the 1970s and 80s, survivors often didn't speak publicly. Some didn't even tell extended family. Sexual assault carried stigma layered on top of trauma. Couples who survived attacks sometimes moved away quietly, trying to outrun memory. But memory is geographic. It lingers in hallways, in bedrooms, in the sound a sliding glass door makes when it shifts in its track. When the Golden State Killer was finally identified as Joseph James DeAngelo, many survivors were thrust back into a spotlight they had never asked for. News vans parked on streets they had tried to normalize again. Reporters requested interviews. Cameras pointed at houses that had once been crime scenes. Some said no. Some said yes, not for spectacle, but for narrative control. For decades, the story had been told through police sketches and terrifying nicknames. Survivors wanted to reclaim it from myth and place it back into human context. They described the details that rarely made headlines: the way he whispered threats, the calculated cruelty of forcing victims to stack dishes on a spouse's back as a warning system, the hours he sometimes lingered. He wasn't chaotic. He was methodical. That methodical nature disturbed criminologists as much as the violence itself. He studied neighborhoods in advance. He entered homes before attacks to unlock windows. He called victims months or years later, re-victimizing them through taunting silence. Control was central. In interviews after the arrest, former profilers revisited early assessments. Some had theorized he would eventually self-destruct, escalate too far, make a fatal mistake. Instead, he appeared to taper off. The murders stopped in 1986. Why? Speculation remains. Some point to increased forensic awareness. The mid-80s saw growing public understanding of trace evidence and DNA. Others cite personal life shifts. He had children. He maintained employment. The logistical risk may have grown heavier than the psychological compulsion. But without a full confession, motive remains fragmented. That fragmentation frustrates victims. One survivor said she wanted to know whether he ever thought about them afterward, whether remorse existed before prison walls forced reflection. Another said she no longer cared about his internal world. He took enough of mine, she stated in court. That tension, curiosity versus refusal, defines much of the aftermath. In Sacramento County, law enforcement created a task force model now studied nationally. Multi-agency collaboration, centralized databases, shared forensic labs. Lessons carved from failure became frameworks for prevention. The case also redefined public perception of serial offenders. For years, media portrayals leaned toward extremes, drifters, visibly unstable individuals, social outcasts. D'Angelo challenged that narrative. He was a former police officer. A father. A neighbor who trimmed his lawn. The banality unsettled people more than monstrosity would have. If evil looks ordinary, how do you detect it? Community members later recalled small incidents, temper outbursts, a stolen hammer accusation, arguments overheard through fences. Nothing that screamed serial predator. Everything that seemed mildly off in hindsight. Hindsight is ruthless. It stitches patterns where none seemed obvious before. The trial process itself became a study in logistical complexity. With crimes spanning multiple counties, Sacramento, Contra Costa, Santa Barbara, Ventura, Orange, prosecutors coordinated an unprecedented consolidation. Plea negotiations ultimately spared survivors from reliving every detail in extended testimony. When D'Angelo accepted multiple life sentences without parole, some felt relief. Others felt robbed of a public unraveling, a cross-examination that might have forced deeper answers. Justice is rarely perfectly satisfying. It is procedural, structured, bounded by law. Trauma is not. In the months following sentencing, podcasts, documentaries, and books revisited the case. The public appetite for true crime remained enormous. Some critics argued that commercialization risked recentering the offender. Others countered that attention kept victims' names alive. The balance is delicate. Storytelling can illuminate or exploit. What remains undeniable is the cultural shift this case accelerated. Police departments across the country established cold case units with dedicated funding. Evidence retention policies tightened. Digital cataloging replaced paper archives. The idea that too much time has passed began losing power. Time no longer guarantees safety for perpetrators. And yet, amid institutional change, the most profound transformations occurred privately. One couple, who survived an attack decades ago, chose to renew their vows after the arrest. Not as a celebration of the case, but as a reclaiming of a night that once nearly defined them. Another survivor visited the neighborhood where her assault occurred and stood in the street at dusk. She later described feeling something unexpected, not fear, but neutrality. The landscape had lost its charge. Perhaps that is what justice ultimately provides. Not erasure. Not revenge. But the slow removal of electricity from a place, a memory, a name. Joseph James DeAngelo will die in prison. But the story does not end with his death. It lives in forensic textbooks. In legislative debates about DNA privacy. In survivors who speak openly now when silence once felt mandatory. The Golden State Killer was once an unseen force in the dark. Today, he is a documented chapter in criminal history. And documentation matters. Because when a story is fully recorded, when names are preserved, when evidence is archived, when lessons are implemented, the darkness loses some of its power. Not all of it. But enough to change what comes next.